Oh, thank you, man. It's great to see you again. Madeleine and I know each other. We were introduced by a common friend. Friend in common is a professor at the University of Toronto with whom I have worked, Joe Wong. And most people don't know, but at UNESCO, we also deal with sports. Everybody knows for culture and education. But we also deal with sports, and that's actually part of my responsibility is sports for development. So it was a pleasure for me to meet Madeleine some months ago, and also to have seen her book and be here today. But Maddie, why don't you tell us about a bit? We hear all the time about climate change. No, it's a big topic. It's probably the biggest threat humanity faces at the moment. But we don't usually associate it with sports, no? So why is it important to discuss it in the context of sports, and how are sports related to climate change? And you can see it from both ways. Sports being affected by, say, natural disasters or heat waves or so, but also sports contributing to climate change. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. So yeah, I actually started studying sport and climate change because I saw it in the ski sector, which is kind of where I saw this first. Really, it's on, I mean, skiing is the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? We don't know how much longer we're going to have it. We were predicting a few years ago that by mid-century, the models were showing we would lose some mountains, and already this year we lost 2 in France that have had to close. So my intro into this was that this is how I came to the issue of climate change. I mean, I knew about it, right? But I had been in a privileged position that I hadn't seen it up close and personal myself. I was living in a place in Canada where we weren't seeing some of the worst impacts yet. This is 10 years ago when I got into it. And what I started thinking about is, for me, for most people like me who, work, I'm in academia, I'm not dealing with the land in a very personal way on a regular basis. I'm not a forester or in fisheries or those kinds of agriculture. And so I thought, well, my introduction to the outdoors is sport and physical activity. And for many, many people, that's how they enjoy their time outdoors. That's what invites them outside, is their football game or their trip to the mountains or their walk along a canal or a river or beach. And so that's how I came to it initially. And I thought, well, if people are watching sports, the statistic in the US right now is that 80% of Americans follow a sport. 17% of Americans follow politics. So if you think about that stat and you think about where's people's attention, we need to leverage sport for everything. And to your point and the work you do in sport for development, which could be any issue really, like how do we use that platform to deal with the hard stuff? So I know it's been done with gender, and that's a conversation that's been long going on. It's one that's going to get picked up in Paris this summer, but how do we achieve gender equity and use sports as a vehicle to do that? How do we use sports as a vehicle to teach kids social skills? How do we use sports to do all these things, health benefits, and I think we can have a conversation about climate change in that environment too.
Oh, excellent. And well, one thing I like very much about your book is that you use a lot of stories. And stories are powerful because they make you really feel the issue. And you were already telling us about the story, how you started writing about this book, your experience in with skiing and the process. But of the many stories, can you tell us about some of the ones you found most fascinating or most provocative? Because there are many, by the way. You're going to see a lot of stories when you read the book.
Yeah, I think, so for me, it was not necessarily the professional sports stories that drew me in. I'm not much of a sports fan. I think people expect I'm going to be a sports fan, and I'm not. I just think they're interesting, and I kind of approach it like an atheist might approach religion. Like, this is fascinating. People are so into this. I want to understand it. And so the stories that pulled me in were the ones of communities and people living their lives, and then, for many people, sport is a big part of their life. So I was visiting communities, for example, in Puerto Rico. One of the interesting stories I heard there was Carmen Yulín Cruz, who was the mayor of San Juan in Puerto Rico, who moved her whole entire staff into the basketball stadium because it was the most secure building in the city. And they actually housed 400 people there for like 6 months during the hurricanes because it was the most stable space to do it. And not only were they housing them there, they were providing sporting activities for kids. It was a center for distributing emergency supplies. And then they started realizing, well, we could do this with every sport facility. So they started building out the materials in different communities, because when the power goes out and the disaster happens and everybody's in a state of crisis, you might not know where a specific address is in your community or how to get there because your phone's not going to work. But you probably know where the basketball court is, or you probably know where the baseball field is. And so if we can get you there and convene there and use this place that people recognize as a place that's supposed to be fun and healing and for community, if we can center those spaces in emergency response, we can actually get somewhere. And they did. They did that for a whole year. They distributed food and emergency supplies at basketball courts and baseball stadiums. And I just thought, that's powerful. That's exactly what sports is originally supposed to do. It's supposed to be the center of a community, or one of them, alongside arts and education and so on and so forth. So that was powerful. But the other one that really shook me up quite a lot was I sat with families who lost their sons to heat stroke. And it's a parent's worst nightmare to lose your kid, right? And heat stroke, it's one of those things that comes on fast. And there are symptoms but no signs usually, right? So the person will feel tired and sweaty, and they'll look a little out of breath, and they might be nauseous and not feel great. But to anybody, any onlooker, it would just look like you just had a really hard practice, maybe take it easy. But actually, if it's really hot and humid out, it might be that their body is warming up too much. And in that case, what's happening is their internal organs are going to start to shut down, because they're not getting enough blood. The blood is going to go to the skin to cool you down. It's not going to take care of the inside, right? So I sat with families who lost their sons to heat stroke and heard from them about what that was like. And this is a direct example of climate change literally taking lives in the context of sport. And now these families are some of the best advocates I've met on climate change. And they're doing it in schools, and they're doing it on the football grounds, and they're doing it, and it's, heartbreaking that that's what it took, but in some cases, that was what it took to get the policies we need, because heat stroke is 100% preventable. There's no reason for a kid or anybody to die of heat stroke. It just requires a bit of simple cooling, bit of water, maybe a cooling towel around the neck. Yeah, get your salts up. But it doesn't have to be complicated. We don't need anyone to pass away. So those were some examples that really shook me up, of sport not only potentially being, in the line of fire, but also potentially being part of the recovery when the worst does happen.
Well, but the heat stroke, it is preventable, as you were saying, so you can treat it immediately before it becomes very serious. But the problem is still there, that, global warming is going to make sports more complicated. There were some stories that I liked about this Indian village where a lot of the really successful runners, marathon runners, come from. I don't know if you want to address that one.
Sure. So I visited a few different kind of really cool sports communities, very niche. One of them was called Iten. It's in Kenya. It's in the southwest corner of Kenya. And this town they call it the home of champions. There's a sign on the way into town that says this is the home of champions. And there's 56,000 people live in this town, 35% of whom live under the poverty line. And the reason they are so successful, there's two things. They have a very strong culture of running. They're told from a young age, you are going to be a runner, and they all believe it. And they do really well, to be fair. 22 Boston Marathon runners in the last 30 years. So, winners, sorry, not just runners, winners. They won out of this tiny town. But they also benefit from just an extraordinary natural environment to do this. They live at altitude. They have near perfect weather conditions year round to run. And they have clay roads, which is maybe the best surface to run on. It's a little bit more forgiving than pavement. It's a little bit better than your grass or something that might be a little too soft. And so they don't get injured. So they can run and log miles, and they don't get stress injuries. They're not getting compound fracture. They're not getting anything. When they fall, it's soft. It's great. So they're able to build up their running capacity from the age of 10, and they do. It's phenomenal. I walked around that town, and these kids were running to school faster than I could run if I tried, and they were maybe 10 years old. And that's starting to go away because they have had drought now for 5 years, and they've had heat. And you put these things together, you get clay roads that are harder than cement. So all of a sudden, they're getting injuries they've never seen before. and they're having issues. The heat is meaning that the training schedule has to shift, so they're running super early in the morning and late at night. They can't run during the day. And it also means the heat at night means they're having trouble sleeping in a lot of cases. And people don't associate that with sport necessarily, but when you can't sleep, you can't focus at school, you can't do your work, and you definitely can't perform in sport. So that community is starting to lose their running culture, and that was jarring to me as well.
Yeah, it shows the effect of climate change in terms of the drought and everything, but also the other side, the positive side, not of the bad result, but the fact that this community sport had a capacity to bring the community together, to it's a poor community, understand, where there was something to live for. So that also calls for the relevance of sports for development. Now, we're having a big year for sports with the Olympics, especially in Paris, and all of you are here, and we're all going to enjoy it and I guess suffer from the Olympics here in Paris. But Paris has been doing, from what I understand, something very interesting. It's been reported in several places, and I've had the opportunity to meet with the folks at the organizing committee for they're building a big sustainability legacy. I understand that London Olympics, they did a very good job on that, but here they're also continuing on that, and the important thing is not that the event itself is as less damaging to the environment as possible, but that it creates a legacy. I don't know if you can talk a bit about that, how we can use these major sports events in that respect.
Yeah, so whenever you get a big sport event, you've got hundreds of thousands of tourists going to come to town, have a big party. In most cases, it's really hard to do that in any kind of sustainable way because they're traveling from all over, they're consuming goods, they're producing waste, etc. But Paris is changing the rules a little bit of how that works, so that's kind of interesting. So Paris announced a few years ago that they would try to be carbon positive with these games. Now, that's not in my view, it's not a reasonable claim. The physics don't actually work. There is no such thing as carbon positive. However, they've made huge strides in terms of how they're delivering these games differently than past games in order to set a new standard for how we can do this better. And one example is all of the venues have been outfitted with electric broadcast, and it seems like a silly little thing, but if you imagine how many cameras and trucks and production equipment would have run off generators, something like 9.8 million liters of gasoline used at the last Olympics to power just the cameras, right? That's not the building, that's not the lights, that's not the air conditioners, nothing, it's just the cameras. So to do that means not only that these games, the broadcast will be all electric, which is brilliant, and it's on the grid, which is cool, and there's a backup grid that's also electric, so the backup plan is also electricity. But they also now have that as a legacy, so all of these buildings moving forward will be able to not have diesel generators on site for broadcast. Now that's just one example, but they've done some interesting things as well with working with the city to advance some of the city's goals, Hidalgo's goals on public transit and on bike access and pedestrian access in certain parts of the city, and it's been interesting to watch that over the last couple of years. I don't live in Paris, but I come quite a lot because we teach a course here. So there's pieces that have been really, really important in terms of how they're doing it. They're using almost all existing facilities. These are good things. That said, the model of having hundreds of thousands of tourists come to a place, have a big party, and go home, that by definition is not sustainable. So the International Olympic Committee is having to think a little bit about how they're going to do things differently moving forward. And one of the things that they've looked at is they just recently, in the last 2 years, removed the minimum size of venues, which is a tiny detail. It sounds tiny, right? It basically means you're not required to have a mega stadium for basketball and a huge stadium for this and a big facility for that. So long as there is a facility that is Olympic caliber in terms of the actual playing field and has broadcast capacity, that's good enough, which is great because all of a sudden we don't need hundreds of thousands of tourists to pay for this and pull it off. We can build it in a way that makes sense for communities in their long-term use. And it puts way more cities on the map in terms of options of where this can go. It doesn't have to be the big cities hosting. It can be your mid-sized city that has some of these venues. So there are important steps being made. The current model doesn't totally work, but Paris has really moved the needle in terms of what's possible. And I mean, it's too early to judge anything because it hasn't even happened yet. But the indicators show that this should be a good round. If a little, you said, we're going to suffer from the games and we're going to enjoy the games, and that's all going to be true. So.
Yeah, and producing all these changes is not easy. For instance, the issue what you were talking about with the broadcasters being forced to connect to the grid. At least the people at Paris 24 told me that the biggest opposition came from the broadcasters themselves, because they said, well, we cannot trust the grid. That's right. So we better bring in our generators because we have these million people watching the event, and we cannot trust it. We don't believe it, no? So it was complicated for France to, I understand, and involve the electricity company to make sure that they have a capacity to provide sufficient electricity on the grid. But my point here also is that you face, to enact these changes, you face opposition. Now, the good thing about here is that it was possible, and then France went ahead and, as you were saying, said, well, from now on, all the stadiums have to be on the grid, no? But it's complicated. In this case, you had the broadcasters being opposed, but some others, like, you were saying, well, we might have to get used to the smaller events, and all of us who enjoy going to the stadium with another 30, 40,000 people, well, maybe that's not going to be ideal in the future. How are we going to ensure that we can enact these changes that are needed and keep the value, the excitement of sports, and the following that people have on the sports?
So the analogy I like to use here is, if you got the opportunity to see your favorite band in a room this size, would you not be stoked about that? Would that not be awesome, right? Like, I think there's something fabulous about these big stadiums, and if they're there, let's use them. But if they don't already exist, do we need to build the big stadium? Or is there a way we can have a more intimate experience? The other part of it is this. I think if you're an athlete, I want you to have the best possible experience. And especially if you've been training for 4 years to do this, or longer. Realistically, it's your whole life, right? So I want them to have an awesome experience. We have events at the Olympics every round that have small facilities. Fencing, not usually a big facility. Weightlifting, not usually a big facility. But they have they still have a crowd, and it still feels fun. And those facilities are loud and exciting, because a packed room of 4,000 people can be just as fun as a packed stadium of 20,000 people. And for the stadium events, like, if you're putting up a football pitch, you're going to have a certain amount of seating anyway. So, the smallest you're going to get on some of those is maybe 15, 20,000, and it's going to feel like a party. But to get people on board, that's going to be the tricky part, I think. And I don't want to shy away from that. There's a lot of people who don't love my ideas. But the world's on fire, and at a certain point, we have to make some accommodations. And I think what we learned during COVID, which is really, I think, instructive, is sport can adapt. Sport doesn't like to adapt. Sport likes to be traditional, but it can. And the broadcast experience, I think, that most people enjoyed during Tokyo was a good example of that. There were no fans in the stands, and yet we got to watch on TV from all around the world, have an awesome experience doing that. I think if we can convince people that they can have an awesome experience at home, that goes a long way. I also think it unlocks, if it's a smaller event on site, we could have a conversation about Mexico City having a fan zone for Mexican fans in the country to celebrate their team, watch on big screens in a main square somewhere, and that would be really fun, because we don't want them traveling all the way over here. And we can have one in Toronto for the Canadians, maybe Vancouver. We can have one in New York and LA for the Americans. And every country can have fan zones and keep them where they are. So you're watching on TV, but you have places to gather and enjoy that experience as well, without hundreds of thousands of people moving from point A to point B. I'm not saying everyone's going to get on board. I'm saying there's a path, there's a way to keep this fun. It can still be fun. It's just going to look a little different.
So your examples on New York, Mexico City, and Toronto, where you're thinking of the next FIFA World Cup in 3 countries.
Yeah. But I mean, we do it, right? Like, when we host FIFA in a few years, every single one of those cities is going to have a fan zone. We do this already for the public in these cities. Why can't we do it for the public in those cities when the event is somewhere else?
No, it's true. It's a good point. But it requires breaking of possession of
Yeah.
people like stadiums and politicians who like to build stadiums and looks big, it's there, it's exciting. But we have to really change in that respect. Now, so where do we go from here? Your final chapters are looking at what comes next, and you outline several options, but what do you think are the most important next steps?
I think there's a few. So the last chapters are pretty grim and then also very exciting. And I know some of the outlines that I have do become a bit Pollyanna-ish in terms of like, they're maybe a little ambitious. But I thought it's my book, I can be ambitious, that's fine. I think the next step is to have an honest conversation about the risks we're currently facing in sport and beyond sport. Because we can't just pretend that sport is a fun thing and it's our entertainment and it lives in a vacuum and it's our escape and therefore it's off the hook. Don't touch my weekend activity, right? Well, no, your weekend activity has people, in some cases hooked up to oxygen tanks on the sideline because the air quality is bad. And the referees are suffering heat stroke at big AFCON events. And you've got, so that's not true. The sport is actually feeling climate impacts already. So we have to acknowledge that. That's one. Two, I think there's common sense policies that can come into play. So FIFA actually, I'm not usually one to celebrate FIFA. One of the things they have done recently that's actually really good is they have new heat policies that apply all the way through every level of the sport. And the heat policy is this: if it gets above a certain temperature threshold and humidity threshold, all of a sudden they activate the heat policy, which means there is a break at the 15-minute mark and the 30-minute mark for a minute each. And the players get off the field, get some water, cool down, and then come back. The purists hate it. They hate it. They don't want sport to be interrupted. They don't want that break. But the athletes love it. FIFPro, the big union for professional footballers, love it. They celebrated this because they said, actually, these players are suffering, and that 1 minute is enough to cool down their body, and then we solve a lot of problems. And the referees get the break too. The officials get a break. And so they make better decisions, and they perform better. So the overall quality of the game is going to be better. So I think common sense, small changes like that, I think there's many of them we can make. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think there's an opportunity to have a big conversation about the role sport can play, not just with climate change, but with everything, and do it with the public. So your work in Sport for Development, dealing with issues like education and health and gender equity and all of these things. What tends to happen in sport at the moment is that happens in one office, usually like a outreach office or a community office or an academy program or something. And then a person responsible for operations over in another part of the building is responsible for the climate stuff. And they don't talk to each other. And I think they probably should, because if we're going to be creating solutions that use the power of sport to activate good outcomes for communities, whether that's poverty alleviation, whether that's education, whatever it is, I think we should be joined up in how we do that so it's also more sustainable. Common sense, basic, like little tweaks, right? These people are in the building already, just have them talk to each other. So I think there's some kind of basic common sense moves that come next. I think the big challenge is going to be the elephant in the room, which is sport brings in a lot of money. It's very much, as you said, it's political in a lot of places. It's part of an agenda for city building in a lot of places and nation building. I think there's going to have to be an honest conversation about that instead of pretending that sport's not political, because we love to pretend that sport is not political. It is. And I think we have to be honest about that as well. So big questions and conversations coming up, but I think it'll be exciting to see it play out.
Right, but for instance, one of the issue you were saying, of the timeout, that's to protect the players, and that's very good. But what about the impact of sports, and not just the big stadiums and getting a lot of people and all the the carbon footprint, but also you had some examples, for instance, on the golf courses and how sport actually also contributes to the problems we're facing. I don't know if you can address a bit to that.
Yeah, so the current best estimate is that sport contributes about 1% of global emissions annually. Now, it's really a rough estimate, right? But it's kind of in that ballpark. That's pretty high. That's roughly the same as the country of Spain. Like, that's high. Now, the things that we can do to change that are going to largely be around how we move, because sport is organized around interregional and international travel. And when you think about even youth sport, where I come from in North America, but somewhere between 75 and 80% of kids get to their sporting practices because a parent drives them. Whereas if you think about school, about the same percentage of kids get to school on a bus or on a metro or some other way, right? Sport, if your kid plays sport, the chances are their sporting activity is their biggest contribution to the carbon footprint in any given week. And for adults that participate in sport, we haven't done the research in my part of the world, but it's been done in Germany, it's been done in France. And adult participation in sport is also a huge contributor to adults' contribution to their carbon footprint, because they're either traveling to participate in their sport or they're traveling to go watch sport. So we have to deal with the elephant in the room on sport, which is, it is very much connected to travel and movement. And so we're gonna have to think about that. There are some things we can do that are pretty simple. Carpooling. If you're driving anyway, pick up a couple other kids, get them there that way. Taking public transit. The big thing here also is part of the reason people choose to drive instead of taking other options is that sport facilities, you have to bring a bunch of gear. You're bringing a towel and your shoes and all your things, and it's a big bag and it's annoying. If there were slightly more storage space for people to leave some of their things, you know, swimmers are a good example. Swimmers will leave their kit at the pool, and then they'll just go home in their regular clothes and come back and their bathing suit is there and their flippers are there and all the rest. We can do that in other sports. That's not complicated. And all of a sudden, we've, you know, unburdened people of all the gear. On golf courses, I love talking about golf courses. 95% of C-suite executives in North America have a golf pass. Donald Trump has a golf pass. He owns a few golf courses. When he was building a wall on the border of Mexico, or thinking about building a wall on the border of Mexico and the US, he was campaigning on it. In those same weeks, he was directing his golf course in Ireland and Scotland to build seawalls to protect the course from sea level rise. He doesn't believe in climate change when it comes to politics, but he believes in it when it comes to golf. So there's an opportunity sometimes to connect with people in ways that you wouldn't expect, right? Business leaders show up at sport events to entertain. Great. Let's have a conversation about the weather. Literally a conversation about the weather. It can be that simple. But yeah, travel. That's the big question in the room. How we power some of these facilities as well. If you think about how much energy it takes to power a big stadium, it can be the same as a whole neighborhood next door. It's huge. So making sure that those buildings are on the grid, and again, these are political questions because the people who control that are usually business leaders and political leaders, and they've got vested interests in how things are. So I think, you know, it seems like common sense solutions. It's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle, but hopefully we get there.
Yeah, because in the end, you want the benefits of sport, and here I'm not talking about, you know, the major sports events or the big professional sports, but just everyday sports and physical activity for people. You still want those benefits, as I mentioned in Sports for Development. You have, you know, the effect on health, but also on, you know, they can reduce violence, they can create social cohesion, they can empower people, can, you know, but you have to do things. It doesn't happen by itself. You also have to do that, and that includes also things that are going to protect the environment. Now, I'm going to cite a paragraph from the book, just because I liked it. It says, Nelson Mandela famously suggested that sport has the power to change the world. I mostly agree with him, and we've seen it work before, but I'd like to add a caveat. Sport has the power to change the world if the sector intentionally organizes itself to do so. So if the sector intentionally organizes itself to do so is the key, no? And that I'm adding myself. Changing the world doesn't just happen. Only Mother Nature can pull that off, and she's doing so. For the world to slow, stop, and reverse the climate crisis and preserve the lives, livelihoods, and games we love, it's going to take all or most of us working together. Climate action is a team sport. I don't know if you want to say something. I like that phrase.
Yeah, I've been saying that for years. There is no individual solution to this. And it doesn't work on an individual organization level either. Like, we have to do it together. Even if you're the biggest, like even if the Paris Olympics says we're going to get this right, well, that's great, but there's 206 National Olympic Committees involved in this. There's 87 sports federations. There's the city and all of the different hospitality partners. Like, you can't just decide to do this by yourself. We all have to be doing it. And I think sport has an opportunity to tell a cool story about that, which is we have language in sport to talk about teamwork, to talk about you win some and you lose some, and that's okay. Sometimes loss is part of it, but you still show up tomorrow and you try again. And you try again, and you try again, and you try again. And I think that there's a narrative around teamwork. Like, yes, we have competition narratives, but we have teamwork narratives that work here in a really meaningful and powerful way. And so I've always, I mean, Nelson Mandela, like what an icon, but I've always thought that sentence was missing something because yes, it has the power to change the world, but he had to work with so many people to do that. He had to work with the teams and the captains and the partners and the event organizers. It didn't just happen. It didn't just like automatically we got rid of apartheid in South Africa. It was an intentional effort. So I think let's apply the same logic and then, roll it out not just for climate change, but everything else.
It's a good one. Now, just to answer, we have some questions. I don't know if you want to talk about, or if you want to provide some additional thoughts, especially implications for people, for sports, all of us.
I think what I'm most hoping people take away from this is it's bad, it's going to get worse. But not all of the worst case scenarios are foregone conclusions. We have so much that we can do and change if we work together. And again, that's like where sport, I think, has such a unique opportunity. When we talk about sports, we're talking about our team, yes, but also our team doesn't exist without other teams being healthy and existing and being fun and competitive. Our events don't happen without other people buying in. And so we have to have conversations about this in all areas of our life. It can't be that the only climate conversations we're having are about polar bears. That's not relatable, right? Or it can't be that the conversations we're having all the time about climate change are about life and death stakes in parts of the world that feel like they're very far away. Those are important. We have to have those conversations. But if we can find ways to have a climate conversation in our day-to-day life, whether it's through sport, whether it's through your work, whatever it is, that's going to unlock, I think, a lot of momentum in ways that so far maybe it feels a little harder to get into that conversation. People think it's too sciencey or it's too far away or it's a later problem. It's a right now problem. It's an ongoing problem, but also the solutions exist.
Excellent. Thank you, Madeleine. Well, perhaps now it's time for questions. If anybody in the audience has one.
Can we have a big round of applause first, please? We will now go to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand high and I'll bring you the microphone. We need to use the microphone so our friends on Zoom can hear us. So, see a hand.
You haven't mentioned the Winter Olympics. And perhaps, yeah, well, no, there's a thought floating around that I've read that since there are fewer and fewer places to have the Winter Olympics, why not put forward the idea of just having one venue? Lake Placid loves the idea, by the way. And practice everything you preach there as a perfect model and try to get the summer guys to also have the Olympics in the same place with the same venues and reuse your materials, because we're duplicating every 4 years, pushing, using all that fresh material and just sort of upgrade all the systems. It seems to be one, if you want to have everybody having the playground in their own countries, which we could then, the Winter Olympics are going to do it because there'll be so few places that even, I think they're having trouble getting anybody to bid for it, the winter, am I not right? So it might be to concentrate on what is doable, which is the Winter Olympics, since it's got deep and profound troubles anyway, and try to save that in one venue and then take that model and come over to the big guys and see if they'll play along when it works so well for the Olympics. So what is that a possibility? Are you thinking that through from your point of view?
Yeah, I have. So it is a possibility. There's a couple versions of that model that are being teased at the moment. The IOC, International Olympic Committee, is currently weighing a proposal on the table, and they haven't announced whether they're going to do it yet. But the current proposal on the table is 4 host countries that would rotate every 16 years. So you'd have it once, and then it would go to place B, place C, place D, and then back to the first place. The benefit is you would never be building new facilities again, which we're about to have games in Milan Cortina, and they can't get anyone to build them a bobsled track because they don't believe it's going to last long. And they're right. It's not going to get that much use after the Olympics. The bobsled and sliding sports are starting to fade. It's getting trickier. I talk about that in the book, but it's hard. So they're looking at venues. Currently, the best climate models that we have, and I worked with colleagues on this in Canada on some of the projections on this, but there are 6 former host countries of Winter Olympics that have venues that will survive from a climatic standpoint into mid-century 6. It's not promising, right? So the U.S. is one, not Lake Placid, Salt Lake, but that's one. Calgary might survive. Sapporo in Japan, although this year maybe tested that theory a little bit. And then there's a couple in the Alps that are at high enough altitude that they could probably do it. Well, so this was based on former hosts, right?
I mean, the Himalayas are our last chance to see snow.
They are, yeah. I mean, there's more glaciers in the Himalayas and then into Pakistan and parts of it. Yeah. The challenge is they don't want to build a whole new facility in a place that doesn't already exist. They've had that policy for about 20 years.
So let's go back to
Please remember that we need the microphone for our friends on Zoom.
So the idea is let's rotate. There's a lot of pushback on that. Not from the Olympic organizers. They're actually quite the ones that I've spoken to are like, yeah, that actually makes sense. We get to preserve the games and we get to do it right and be sustainable about it. There's pushback from countries that want to host it that wouldn't therefore get the chance. And there's pushback from communities of skiers and people who live in these places who are realizing if we go to 4 places over and over and over, that will be the location for every other winter sport event in between, your world championship and your competitions, and everything will happen in those places, and everyone else will lose that business. So it's a tricky one. Again, it's always political. But that's one way to do it. And yeah, there's a lot of winter sport in here. I'm Canadian, so I didn't shy away from winter at all.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I was a very interesting conversation. Thank you. I was just wondering if you're aware of any initiatives that the Olympic Committee has undertaken to share the learnings of how they're making the Paris Olympics greener with the rest of the world and every corner of the world, from grassroots sports and upwards?
Yeah, great question. The Olympic Committee has a person in their sustainability office whose whole entire full-time job is to help the national Olympic committees and the federations in every part of the world to learn how to do this. This person, by the way, Julie, she was the head of sustainability, or one of them, in Rio. She worked on London, so she's actually been in several games and is taking those learnings bit by bit as we develop them and taking them to the next place. But now that's her role, is to kind of run this through the Olympic movement. She's the work in educating different parts of the world is awesome. Really, like, they have 2 annual meetings for the international federations. They have athletes come in and learn how to do this. They have organizers learn how to do this. The challenge is there are some parts of the world who are not responsible for climate change, who are already feeling the brunt, whose efforts and money are going into saving their lives and don't necessarily have time or energy to be thinking about reducing their carbon footprint, right? So, and there's an ethical question around, like, is that their problem to solve anyway? So the challenge that the IOC is currently facing is it's got to be a bit of a bespoke ask of each place, what makes sense in that place and what kind of responsibility is there, but also what capacity is there. And in a lot of cases, national Olympic committees, you'd be hard pressed to find one that doesn't want to address climate change, but they don't always have, there's countries that their national Olympic committee has 4 people on it and 2 of them are volunteer parents. So it gets tricky. But the big ones are mostly involved, and they're engaged, and they're talking to, the United Nations Environment Program and the International Union for Conservation of Nature put together the Sports for Nature campaign 2 years ago. We have the Sports for Climate Action campaign that's ongoing. There's work happening to educate ministers as well, and you're involved in that work on this and every other SDG issue. And so that's happening with ministers, and I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. But there's work happening to get sports people at every level involved in this.
Yes, in fact, for instance, one of the things we're going to be doing at UNESCO and issuing in July what we call the major sports event label. What we want is a label that basically you get it if you have an impact and a legacy on sustainability and development. And that's not just during the event. During the event you have to, we're looking not at the economics of it, but at the social impact. You have to have gender equality, you have to protect human rights, you have to be green in your operation, in your carbon footprint, in your impact on the use of water and others. But we also want a legacy for the future. And one of the items that we're going to have in that label is precisely these initiatives, like the one you were talking about, the broadcasters, that we want to incentivize major sports events to develop these new ways of doing things, like they did here in Paris with scrapping all the diesel generators and using the grid instead. To be always on the lookout for the new thing that's better for development and better for the environment. And we're going to have Paris 24 as the first pilot, and hope to refine the system over the future. But we're also working on a report on sports for development, the impact on development of sports, to incentivize investment in sports. And here I'm talking about grassroots sports, not professional or commercial sports, and also very much related. We're working on gender issues very much. We're going to be issuing what we call the game plan for safeguarding women and girls, for promoting development, and so on. So yeah, we're working on that, and it's something that we need countries to adopt and to support on that. So.
Staying with the Olympics for one moment, we have a question from Amanda on Zoom. She asks, is there anything Paris residents can do during the Olympics to mitigate the environmental impact of the games themselves?
Watch it on TV.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, if you live here and you're living your regular life, you're not part of the problem on this when it comes to the event. Like, it's coming to your city. Be good hosts, but otherwise it's kind of more about don't make it worse. So if you know how the transit system works and you know how to get from point A to point B by walking or cycling or whatever else, do it and demonstrate that it's safe to do it and it's fun to do it and it's totally fine. But really, if you're a resident of Paris, like, it's not your response. I'm kind of more speaking to like the Americans and Canadians like me that are going to come over and mess things up. So, just live your life, try to enjoy it. There's going to be some disruption. They're going to close down a bunch of roads. It's going to be loud. Just try to enjoy it, ride it out, and then keep the pressure on the city to make all of those things stick. Everything that they implemented for the games, new bus lines and the bike lanes that they've put in, and all of keep the pressure on. Don't let up, because there have been cases where there are Olympics and they happen and it's great, and then like 6 months later there's a new plan or a new person in charge and they walk away from some of those projects. Don't let them walk away. Hold them to it. No. You said we were going to have a legacy. Hold them to the legacy, and that's one thing that I would say to do.
Indeed.
Sorry. Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It was really interesting to listen to. And so I have a question regarding what you just said like a couple of minutes ago about the legacy for the future. So regarding the politicians and their actions, because as you said, climate action is a team effort. So it goes from above, kind of, and we just follow the rules. I just mean that it's not individual. So even if we as individuals do a lot of effort, it will not make such a big change as if we spread awareness. And yeah, so the question was, because you were talking about what we learned from COVID, that sport can adapt, but politics can also adapt. So sorry, can you? Yeah, so politics can also adapt. So the power of sports is more or less equal to the power of politics, as it influences people who interest themselves for it. And so when the threat to the population is so global as this thing, the climate change, then the politicians should make as big changes in the laws as they did during COVID. Because we saw that was what we learned from COVID. That's what they did, right? They shut down the borders and everything. So they...
Yeah. There's an old saying, right, that politicians will make change by design or by disaster. And with COVID, we saw it by disaster, right? I don't think that we need to lose as many people and have as much disruption as we had during COVID in order to act on climate change. So I would say that distinction, like, we have advance notice. We know this is coming. In many cases, we're already feeling the impacts. There's an opportunity to act with advance notice and to have that be really good. And then I think, sports attract attention in a way that politics sometimes have a hard time attracting attention, especially from young people who have way more capacity to vote than we currently do in basically every country. So I think there's an opportunity for big sport events to be flash moments that pull the politicians in, because the politicians legally have to co-sign everything basically that's happening on the games, because fundamentally they're paying for it. So I think there's an opportunity always to have a conversation about what politics can do when we're talking about what sports can do, because they're so visible. But it's not always easy, because there's always going to be people in the jurisdiction that don't want it. And specifically, there's corporate interests and different people who benefit from the way the model currently works, and who are going to put pressure to keep it that way. So it's not, I hope we change by design this time, I guess is what I'm saying. And I hope we use sports as we can point to it and say, look, there's the evidence that we can make change, but also there's the evidence that impacts are happening right now. Like, people are suffering right now, and it's not just some foreign issue that happens far away. If we put swimmers in the Seine, that's maybe not a good idea unless we want to clean it up a lot in the next 2 months. A lot, like completely. But if the other big piece is, like, we're going to have athletes competing in temperatures that are expected to get up to 40 degrees in the middle of the day, right? That happened in Tokyo, and for half of the events that kind of got into those ranges, they had to stop the event and postpone it to later. And if you're an athlete, and I'm, never competed at that level, I was a kid athlete, but that if you're training and getting ready for a 3 p.m. race, you're planning your sleep around that timing, you're planning your food around that timing, you're planning to peak at that time. And then when they say, just kidding, 8 p.m., that's very stressful, right? So I think we're going to see some of that. I mean, we saw it last year. The Tour de France came through, and it was like 36 degrees on that day. Athletes were collapsing at the finish line. People standing along the sidelines to cheer at the Arc de Triomphe were not collapsing, because a lot of them were just sitting on the side, but they were struggling in the heat. So I think there's going to be an opportunity to have a big conversation about this summer. And I think Paris, having already committed to saying we care about this and we're going to act on it, I think there's an opportunity to pick up that conversation and boost it so much more.
And the voice of athletes is also very strong. And you talk about it a bit in your book, how you can use athletes who are much more popular than politicians and, have a bigger following. And there are several who have really devoted themselves to either the development aspect, the quality aspect, or the climate aspect.
Yeah.
Time for one more question.
First, thanks to you both and to the American Library for creating such an enlightening and educational evening. You mentioned that you come to Paris because you say we are teaching a course. Who is we? Where are you teaching it, and when is it?
So I'm a sport ecologist. I study climate change in sports. My husband, standing in the back taking pictures, is a sports sociologist. And we were invited by M. Lyon to teach a sport and social issues course in February each year. So we come in, and that's actually when I met Gustavo, was last time I was here in February, to their grad program. Yeah.
Can we please have a big round of applause for our speakers?